As background for me, I'm a social psychologist here at the University of British Columbia. I did my graduate work back here at UBC in the aughts. And then I was hired back here in 2018 as part of this special program in Canada called the Canada 150 Research Chairs. And that was for Canada's 150th birthday. The federal government sponsored about a couple dozen chairs across the country in various fields. And departments competed. They nominated people and competed to be one of the departments at various universities that could get one of these chairs as a new line in their departments. And the reason that's relevant is because there was, as part of the call for the program, it indicated that preference would be given to members of four groups. Visible minorities, which includes me as a South Asian, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and women. And my department, being the shrewd operators that they are, realized that if they're in a competition for these positions, and it's the case that preference is going to be given to any of those groups, well, we're only going to nominate people who are part of one of those groups. And so anybody who's not part of that group wasn't considered as part of the nomination. And this strategy worked out very well. They got one of these chairs. It worked out well for me. I got to come back to this university. But there was one issue, which was that I knew that I was selected in part for characteristics that were outside of my own doing. They weren't my research expertise or promise or teaching expertise. They were to do with these demographic characters that I had really no control over. And that made me realize that I was selected for a different set of criteria than all of the rest of my colleagues were. And it made me know that they knew that as well. And it meant that the department itself was selecting from a somewhat smaller pool of candidates when they were choosing whom to nominate. And I've thought about that ever since, because those were costs to having that preference, to having those preferences for those members of four groups. It's not necessarily a problem, because those costs may be outweighed by the benefits that they bring. But the problem was that those benefits were never made clear to me. And as far as I've been able to tell on search committees that I've been on since, it's never really made clear to anybody. It's something that's sort of vaguely in the background of our conversations, but we never explicitly talk about that question, this question, which is diversity for what? Why are we trying to give preferences to these groups? We all recognize diversity is important, but we don't really talk about why. And it's what made me think about this question quite a bit. I worked on this, the paper that this talk is based on during my sabbatical last year. And I'm hoping to share my thoughts with you and some of the data that I've collected about it. So the first point I'll make is that, well, at this point, diversity is not an elephant. So when you're on these search committees, you guys, I'm sure, have been on search committees. It's funny, I gave this talk as an aside to the American Philosophical Association. At the end, they said, this is very interesting stuff, but we don't get to hire people anymore. So this is why we don't really care. But I think you guys probably still get to hire people.
Yes.
I'm on a search committee right now, and we have these types of discussions. Everybody is on board with the idea of diversity in the abstract. And then it comes to concrete questions when we're actually down to a long list or mid list or short list or whom we're going to bring out to the interview. And then you realize that, well, people didn't really have the same idea of what diversity is. You'll come to these concrete questions, in my field at least, like, well, is it better to hire a white person who's working on topics of diversity or a person of color who's not? Which serves our departmental goals better? Should we count an Asian person as diverse? Within psychology, should we count a woman as diverse? What about viewpoint diversity? And all of a sudden we realized that, well, though we thought we were on the same page, we actually weren't. in that sense, diversity is kind of like the opposite of the Indian parable of the blind men and the elephant. Instead of being everybody feeling the same animal and thinking it's a different one, we're often feeling different animals thinking it's the same. And so the first question becomes, well, what is diversity? There's a political philosopher that I'm fond of. Some of you guys may be fond of him too, Isaiah Berlin. And he's got this very famous essay called Two Concepts of Liberty. And in it, he's got this really nice paragraph where he tries to distinguish liberty from other constructs that it's often confused with. And he says, everything is what it is. Liberty is liberty. It's not X, Y, and Z. And I think that's true for diversity as well. Diversity is diversity. It's not justice or fairness or equality. It's not academic innovativeness or strength. It is diversity. And I think it's important to recognize that it may lead to those other values that we might care about, but that connection needs to be established, measured, demonstrated, rather than just asserted, let alone just conflated with the concept of diversity itself. So then what is diversity? People vary on all sorts of things. We are diverse creatures. We vary on gender and race and socioeconomic status. We differ on personality and political preferences. We differ on all manner of things, but only some subset of those very variable variables that we actually differ on are relevant to faculty hiring. And which ones depends on that question from before, which is diversity for what? What are your rationales? The rationales determine what type of diversity we should be prioritizing, to what degree, that is, do we need to aim for a handful of a particular group of people? Do we need to aim for population proportionality? Do we need to aim for a 50-50 split? It depends on the rationale. At what level do we need to have the diversity? Is it important that we have the diversity at every department in every university, or is it important that we have the diversity simply at the level of the field? Again, all of these questions depend on the rationales for diversity, but that's something we tend not to talk about very much. Maybe you do. Maybe you do in the grants that you write, where you have to justify the programs that you're involved in. But I've found on the research committees, and in many of my experiences in academia, that we tend not to ask this question very much. One of the reasons why I think we don't is that diversity within academia has been treated as somewhat of a sacred cow. The primary research area that I've worked on for 15 years, 20 years, is on the psychology of religion. And within that literature, there's a construct that's studied a lot called sacred values. And sacred values, in the way it's described in psychology, have a number of particular features. So one is that they tend to be about issues of moral and ethical importance. Two, defending them tends to be associated with group identity. Three is that they tend to be resistant to trade-offs or compromises. You don't want it's not easy to just trade something which is a sacred value, something like fairness or equality or democracy or your children, for some amount of money. And four is that even just bringing up the questions can often be met with moral outrage. I saw that there was a question in the chat. But
don't worry, Azim. I just wanted to. You asked the question about how often we address what is diversity, and I just wanted to pull up the idea that we've nuanced it with the concept of intersectionality, which we think that has helped us understand what diversity is, and I think at some level it has, and yet at some level it just is a reification of the same issue. So
Okay.
keep going. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we can definitely talk about that more later after I present the rationales that I've delineated here. So sacred values is one reason why I think we're hesitant to talk about this question of why diversity. Another is that it just seems like common sense. We know why we care about diversity. Obviously, we value diversity because of X or Y or Z. And so why bother having the conversation about it? Now, personally, as a social scientist, I am in the business of questioning things which are common sense, and of resisting the worship of sacred cows. And to not do so in this particular case, in the case of diversity, would be not living up to the standards of inquiry that we use for every other question. So I think these are not good reasons not to ask this question. But these are more reasons why to not ask the question. They're not actually positive reasons why we should ask the question. There, I think we have actually some more practical reasons why it is worth actually explicitly delving into what these rationales are, rather than just leaving them sort of vague or in the background or implicit. And those, here are four of them. So one is the one that I alluded to when talking about the search committees. People tend to misunderstand each other when they're on search committees. They'll think that they're on the same page, as I mentioned. But when it comes to then concrete questions, people will be confused because they assume that other people are pursuing the same rationales, are pursuing diversity for the same rationale as they are. And then when they see somebody suggest that, well, we should favor this candidate rather than this candidate, you can often get confused. Why would you pursue that candidate rather than this candidate if your rationale was the same one that I'm implicitly holding in my head? Only when we get on the same page about what our actual goals can we then understand what other people are saying and potentially become more efficient and effective decision makers. The second one is that oftentimes, if we start singularly focusing on diversity, rather than the thing that diversity was supposed to achieve, say improving role modeling for our students or eliminating discrimination, then we can achieve the measure that we're looking for. We can achieve a diverse faculty, say, without actually addressing those problems which actually motivated our need for diversity. We might have created a diverse faculty, but those problems, reaching particular students or eliminating bias from hiring, those may persist unaddressed, even if we have achieved the measure that we now become obsessed with. So that's one thing I think we ought to avoid by talking about these things. The third point is sort of a philosophical point. So this is based on Mill, but I think it might be one of the two more relevant ones for this group, which is that Mill has this point that when we stop questioning our values, they tend to turn into superstitions, or what he calls dead dogmas, that we don't really remember why we were pursuing them to begin with. And that has a bunch of different problems. But one of them is that if they then ever become challenged, we don't know how to defend them because we don't really remember what our reasons for pursuing it are in the first place. And as a result, we need to be periodically revisiting our justifications, our explanations, and our rationales for any value that we're pursuing, diversity among them. And then the fourth one, and this may be the other one which is most relevant to this group, and maybe most relevant at this moment, is that as much as we in the academy like to think that we're in this ivory tower that floats above everything, we are very much beholden to the societies in which we're embedded. We live off the trust and the beneficence of the wider society. And when that starts to go away, it has very acute costs to what we do. This is a chart I made from Gallup data. Gallup has been keeping track for about 30 years now of Americans' confidence in their institutions. And about 10 years ago, they started including higher education among those. What you see is that over the 30-year time period, there's been a general decline in trust of institutions. It's declined about 10%. But in the 10 years that they've been measuring higher education, it's declined to 20%. It's still pretty high relative to other institutions, but you've rarely seen a decline this steep, this quick. The only other times you've seen it are the confidence in the presidency between the end of the Clinton era and the Iraq War era Bush II regime. You also saw it in confidence in banks from before to during the financial crisis. So these are not great examples that we want to emulate. And I think that this is a real concern, because this could really be an existential concern for our profession. And it's not just on the right that you see this decline. You see it in all political groups. It's deepest on the right. So you can see their confidence, the people indicating that they have a great deal of confidence in higher ed decline from over 50% just 10 years ago among Republicans to now around 20%. But it's also declined among independents and Democrats. And altogether, among Americans, it used to be 10 years ago when they started collecting these data that I think 5 or 6 times as many people had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher ed versus very little or none. And now those numbers are actually equivalent. So we've gone from 5 to 1 to basically equivalent. That's a pretty concerning trend. Now, this could be our fault. Perhaps higher ed has lost touch with the concerns and values and attitudes of the everyday public. There's an article that I'm halfway through reading in the Chronicle this morning by William Deresiewicz, in which he makes this point that we are completely out of touch. It could not be our fault at all. Either way, it is our problem. And so I think that if we're going to try to regain some of this trust, or at least stop the bleeding, I think it's important that we communicate that the academy is based on explainable principles rather than sort of inexplicable maxims, the dead dogma that Bill talked about. Now, you don't have to kind of subscribe to all of these reasons, but I think any one of them is justification enough that we should actually talk explicitly about the rationales for why we're pursuing diversity in faculty hiring and academia broadly. So let's get into that. Now, in the diversity literature, they tend to bifurcate diversity rationales into 2 categories. One, and the original one, are justice rationales. So coming out of the civil rights movement in the United States, but also other civil rights movements in India, South Africa, etc., there was a push for diversity because it's the right thing to do, a moral case for diversity, that it should be pursued because of these injustices that have been going on in the past, and this is the way that we correct them. Now, for various reasons, including some notable Supreme Court cases over the last 50 years, I guess, there's been somewhat of a shift, actually quite a bit of a shift, to instrumental rationales. And these rationales are utilitarian reasons for why we would benefit from having diversity in terms of least performance or a cognitive division of labor, or all these benefits to, say, science or learning that come from having a more diverse group of people. This distinction, I think, is useful, but I think it's also limited within academia for a couple reasons. So one is that there are certain rationales which blur this distinction. So for instance, one of the ones I'll talk about is the role modeling rationale, that you need to see it to be it. With a more diverse faculty may be better able to reach a more diverse set of students. That is instrumental because it makes us better at our job of actually educating the people that we're charged with educating. but it's also a justice rationale, because the groups that you are improving ability to reach are the groups that have been historically disadvantaged. So there's some that I think blur the distinction, but also it lacks granularity, because within the academy, I think there's many different rationales that actually fall under each of these categories. And to just say justice or instrumental rationales could miss the priorities of some instrumental rationales over others, or some justice rationales over others. So there are, I think, certain rationales which are specific to academia that we can talk about. You see in certain other professions, so the military is a good example, the police are another good example. They have specific diversity rationales which make sense in their profession and not necessarily in other professions. So in the military, for instance, you have this very hierarchical organization where the stakes are life and death. There have been calls for a very, very long time that the fact that you have a more racially diverse group of subordinates and a more racially homogenous from the dominant group among the brass leads to a reduction in morale and cohesion among the various units. And that's why in the recent last year or the year before a Supreme Court case that challenged the use of race-conscious admissions had this exception for military academies. The military really pushed for this because they thought it's instrumentally very important for what they do. In the police, you have a different rationale, which is that you very much need to be trusted by the community you're serving, and if you don't look like that community, you fray that trust. And so there's been a lot of efforts that police departments look like the communities that they are serving. Here are the 10 rationales that I've, based on my reading, come up with for academia, not for academia, for faculty hiring specifically. I think there's different rationales. Some are overlapping, but different rationales for student diversity. But for faculty hiring, these are the 10 that I've come up with. And this is probably the most important slide in the deck. So we can linger on it for a bit. I'm happy to talk about any of these in more depth in the Q&A, including what my review of the evidence has shown as to whether they're supported. So I've looked through, for the ones that make sense to look through for empirical data on whether diversity actually helps to achieve these various goals, and found that it does for some and it doesn't for others. And I found a lot of that research surprising, so I'm happy with any of those individually more. I will, at the end of my talk, give a link to the paper that I've written on this, which goes into more depth on each of those. For right now, I was thinking, how many people do we have in the audience here? Is it worth doing this? I made a little voting thing. If you guys use your the QR code or put this in into your browser, you can vote on the single one of these, which you think is the strongest motivator for gender diversity in STEM in particular. And I think this is worth doing for two reasons. One is it can reveal to each other what you guys actually think are the key motivators. Also, it would very much help me to understand that particular corner of the whole diversity question. You guys are experts on this stuff. I am not, so I'm really curious to hear what the beliefs about that is. I have a talk about next is a survey that I conducted of department heads across the UK, US, and Canada, where I asked their attitudes about these rationales, as well as about what types of diversity should be prioritized. And I could talk about the connection between those two things, which types of diversity to prioritize and what the rationales are. But I'll give you guys just a second more to vote on this and to just read over these if you want to. Like I said, we can return to the slide in the Q&A if you want to talk more about any one of these 10 rationales. I'm just going to see if I can see how the voting is going here. Okay, this is good.
We have 31 people in our audience right now, just so
Yeah, that's great. So we're seeing some good numbers, and I'll share the slide here at the end of the talk as well.
Beautiful. Because I'm curious too. You've asked a super good question, framing it as you did around the elephant being, which aspect of the elephant do we each prioritize when we're thinking about this work?
Okay, so as I mentioned, this department chair survey. So this was conducted this spring, just over 300 department chairs. A 25% response rate was pretty good. Maybe it was less considering how much money I incentivized these department chairs to complete the survey, but whatever. I sent it to 1,300 people, and I got 320. It's pretty good. It allows us to see some trends. It doesn't allow us to slice things as finely as I would have hoped, but we can do some slicing. It was from 15 disciplines, pretty evenly spread, not just in terms of the disciplines. I specifically picked 5 from the humanities and arts, 5 from the social sciences, STEM, but the response rate was pretty similar between all of those as well. So we have roughly equal numbers. A few just broad points. So virtually everybody said that diversity is something that they discuss when doing hiring. So everybody's talking about this. Everybody cares about this. Notably, only a quarter said that diversity was not sufficiently factored into hiring decisions, but about half said that diversity rationales were not adequately explained or discussed within their department. And that's the department head saying that. I expect that would be even higher for the rank and file faculty members. So there is seemingly a hunger for people to at least talk about the rationales more. People seem to be on board that we're doing what we should for diversity, but not that we're talking about it enough, not that we're talking about the rationales enough. So what I'm going to first show you is which forms of diversity are prioritized. And here's what it is overall. So you see race, ethnicity is the top, gender and race are the top 2. Probably not surprising. In different countries, indigeneity, of course, matters in different countries, matters a lot in Canada, a little less in the US, and basically not at all in the UK, which I guess makes sense. Social class, and then you see it declining there with political viewpoint right at the bottom. If you look specifically at STEM, so I broke these down in terms of the categories that I think you all would be most interested in. You see STEM is pretty similar with some notable exceptions. And the big notable exception is gender. So STEM is more important gender is more important for the STEM department chairs, and it is the most important kind of leapfrogging race as the most important form of diversity for faculty hiring. The other ones that are significantly lower are socioeconomic class seems to matter less to STEM people, nationality matters less to STEM people, and political viewpoint matters less to STEM people. And I have, I think, likely explanations for why all of those are true. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you guys matter. But basically, I think that those things can affect the questions that are asked in the social sciences, humanities, more than they affect the things that are asked in STEM. And so it's less of a priority for the kind of work that's done in STEM to care about those types of diversity than others. If we look across the various fields that we collected for, this is just for gender diversity. So you can see that the darker blue are the STEM fields. So you see in the STEM fields, they're all clustered towards the top half, all in the top half. The only other 2 that are in there are philosophy and economics. And then when you see the social sciences and humanities, the priority is much less. This, I think, is probably unsurprising. This corresponds pretty closely to the percentage of women that are in those fields. You see here the percentage of male faculty, and then the gender diversity hiring priority. Gender studies is the outlier here, but I think that's because when I asked about what form of diversity to prioritize, I said gender diversity, not necessarily women. So it might be that in the gender studies, when they see gender diversity, they mean we need to get more men in. And so if you redo this, we're just looking at a deviation from 50-50. you see that's even a stronger relationship there, right? So you have this cluster here at the bottom, anthropology, psychology, many of the arts and humanities, they're at 50%, and so diversity is not a huge priority. Then you have this other cluster, philosophy, biology, which is sort of in the middle, and then you have computer science, engineering, economics. These are the ones which are deviate most from 50% representation, and not surprisingly, are the ones where gender diversity is a hiring priority. Okay, now let's look at the rationales. So this is the ordering of which were reported to be the strongest motivations among the department chairs for hiring. And you see at the top there is this hidden merit family of rationales that I talked about. This is also called the talented workforce rationale, that by not having a diverse workforce, we're missing out on the top talent. And there's a couple ways that we could be doing that. One is that when it comes to the searches, stereotypes, our prejudices, our biases mean that even though certain people have the strongest applications, we are biased against them. We're not noticing that. But that's only one way. Accounting for disadvantage is the idea that, well, maybe the most promising candidate is not the one with the strongest application at the time of applying. And that's because they faced more headwinds in getting there. If you have somebody with the same quality and number of publications out of a PhD program at the University of Saskatchewan, and somebody who's coming out of Harvard with the same quality of publications, well, what does that tell you? I think it tells you that with all the resources that you have at Harvard, that person was able to achieve what this person in the Canadian prairies was able to accomplish with much less. And therefore, if you roll the tape forward, the person from the University of Saskatchewan is likely to be the more promising scholar, given the same environment moving forward. And so that disadvantage, I think, means that you don't underpredict the promise of certain people. Then you have the second category, the role modeling category, improving learning outcomes, improving grades and graduation rates among particular students, but also exploding stereotypes, inspiring people, having people at the front of the class looking like people in the rest of the class is perceived to be useful for that. Then you have the heterodoxy ones. Well, the research actually improves when you have different types of people. Then institutional signaling, and then at the bottom you have the social justice ones, the social reorganization and social restitution. I will note that a number of people in the open response comments to this said, well, we're legally not allowed to pursue things for these social justice reasons. That is due to, again, some nationwide Supreme Court cases in your country, but also what you've been seeing in some of the red states with more explicit laws and policies that are coming in, which may now be seen more broadly. I don't really know what's going to happen in the next 4 years, but we may see that kind of thing extend more broadly. For STEM, you see this is more or less the same. There aren't really many differences here. I'll let you guys just digest that for a second. One of the only difference, in fact, the only difference, is in this raising different questions one, this heterodoxy one. So you see that in STEM, and this speaks to the point I made before, in STEM, raising different questions is less of a priority, less of a motivation to increase diversity than it is in other fields. In my discipline of the social sciences, the history of the sciences has been this. You bring in people who are previously underrepresented in the academy, and it expands the fields. So you bring in Black sociologists, it changes the discussion of race. You bring in female anthropologists, there are new questions that are being asked that weren't asked before. You bring in East Asian psychologists, all of a sudden it explodes our views of what's universal about the human mind. You might not see that for chemistry and black holes. I assume you all work on chemistry and black holes. That's what I assume you do all in STEM. Okay, so this is not a slide that I would share if it wasn't this kind of group. This is the regression table linking the various types of diversity, which you can see if you can squint at the top there, with the different motivations, which are the top 5. You have the different rationale, as well as discipline, country, and certain characteristics of the department head. And I'll highlight the gender one here and speak to a few points that I find interesting. So one is that the rationales that are most associated with prioritizing gender diversity are the role modeling rationale and the hidden merit one. Of course, that's not to say that those are clearly what's causing it, but what it is to say is that the people who care most about gender diversity are also the people who care most about role modeling being the motivation for diverse hiring and hidden merit. So remember, those two are about improving the students' outcomes because of potential previous mismatches between the faculty and the student characteristics. And then hidden merit is that talented workforce rationale. We might just be leaving talent on the table by missing out people from certain groups. And I'll note here that if you look in the second column, step 2, those are still significant once you control for the field differences. So that's not just because of a STEM effect. So I'll highlight that point next. This is just to show that even considering everything else, the priority in STEM is higher for gender diversity. And then here I'll point out, maybe this is a surprise to you. It was a bit of a surprise to me that the people who seem to be championing this most are white men. And again, that's controlling for all these other characteristics. So despite the fact that we might have differences between who is a department chair in these different fields, that's accounted for in this already. It's for some reason, white people, and particularly men, seem to be more motivated by gender diversity for faculty hiring. I'll just leave this up for a second longer, and then I'll kind of wind down to a conclusion here. So the elephant in the room, just to return to a different elephant metaphor for a second, is that the political right has now got a lot more power in your country, and it will soon do so in my country as well. What are the implications of that? What does that mean for how we're going to do our jobs? I think surely there are certain people, potentially a lot of people, who are just going to be either people who have various forms of bigotry or are clinging to parochial power structures in this group. But I don't think that's most people. I think most people, whether they're DEI skeptics or they're DEI advocates, are fair-minded, reasonable people who are persuadable. And their persuasion is our best tool to use for advocating for the things that we think are right. But to get to that persuasion, I think the first thing that we need to do is to make clear to ourselves why we are actually pursuing these values like diversity, why we're actually doing it. Once we get clear on ourselves, once we do that periodic revisitation of these values like Mill has compelled us to, we're going to be better at being able to persuade others of doing so. So I encourage you within your departments and your research groups to have these conversations about the rationales for diversity. I think a lot of people, from what I've talked to, a lot of people really do want to have these conversations, but they're hesitant to do so. And part of the reason they're hesitant to do so is they look around and they see nobody else having that particular conversation. And so I think I think they're just for permission to talk about it. And so that's one of the reasons I think that this little mini speaker series is great, because it's giving people that permission. I think we should do that more broadly.
Oh, okay. I love what you just said there, because I think that was one of the key takeaways from your presentation when I saw it first. And I keep getting more takeaways each time I listen to your words and reflect on the concept that you're talking about. But one of the key ones is that we all come to the table with a different sense of what it is that we're meaning when we say diversity. And so it's very important that we define that and nuance it, particularly in light of the pushback that we've been receiving. So I want to open this up. You have an opportunity to, oh, thank you.
Well, what I just wanted to note that the QR codes I have at the bottom here is results. I'll put up those results in a second, but
Okay.
if anyone wants the paper, the larger paper I talk about all this stuff, you can just scan that QR code and it'll basically write the email to me for you, and then I will respond to it with the actual paper. And so what I'll now do is I'll see if I can shift my window, stop this, and I will reshare with the results here. So everybody
love it.
So the two biggies were among the role modeling ones. So one of them was among the role modeling one, which is improving learning outcomes for students, and the second was improving team creativity and performance.
Wow.
It's interesting that those are the two, and the reason it's interesting is because those were that and raising different questions, which none of you picked. Those were the three ones that I was probably the biggest proponent of for pursuing diversity before I started this project. But then as I've reviewed the literature, and it's a mixed literature. All of these are mixed. The research quality is mixed. There are a lot of different disciplines in here. Those two are the ones that I found surprisingly least supported by the data. There tend to be small effects for race, for professor match. The effects for gender are very, very much mixed for improving actually both learning outcomes and non-learning outcomes for students for having gender match. And then improved team creativity and performance. Here, there's been an enormous amount of research. What you tend to find here is that the diversity of a research group or tends to explain under 1% of the variance in terms of the performance or creativity as measured by these studies. There are certain moderators there which are relevant to academia. When you have complex problems, that goes up a little bit. What we deal with is complex problems. There are some very interesting studies that show that gender diverse teams and ethnically diverse teams, research teams, create more impactful papers. But it's not clear, and the people who've written these papers, they're very large. Millions of researchers that are put through these massive machine learning analyses. They're not clear as to why that's the case. It may be just, this is the most mundane explanation, that when you have a more diverse research team, your audience is also more diverse, and that leads to the paper being more impactful, which still counts. But it's not really improved creativity and performance. It's just improved reach. All right. Anyways, I'm happy to answer any questions now. I'll stop sharing unless you guys want me to go back to a slide, but we can talk more.
Give people a little bit of time to digest and reflect on their questions. And
I guess or just maybe reflect on the last thing that you said, Azim, which is, improved reach is improved performance. If something is published, it's meeting our minimum requirements for, validity and rigor. So at that point, like, the science is not going to be better in one place or another. At that point, it's all, like, impact is all outreach connection. That is quality post publication. Rigor is quality pre-publication, but we have to assume that that's happening, right?
Yeah, you know what? I think you're right. And another way in which improved performance is that increased reach leads to more synergy. It leads to people from different fields or different audiences who otherwise wouldn't read this stuff, incorporating the insights from research into their own work, which really I think does broaden research. I think you're right. I think I gave that a little short shrift. I'm going to just drop a link to the paper I think this is way easier if I just drop a link to the paper in the chat if you guys